Prime curtain charging. Structure sold.
Awaiting at
Structure
once.
sold.
Affirmative.
Our base is
Affirmative.
under attack.
Yes, sir. Reporting. Affirmative. Yes, sir. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Yes, sir. At once. Agreed. Awaiting orders. Affirmative. Comrade. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Vehicle affirmative. Reporting. Affirmative. Reporting. Very well. Reporting. Acknowledged. Reporting. Affirmative. Yes, sir. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Reporting. Affirmative. Very well. Yes, sir. Affirmative. Affirmative. Reporting. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Awaiting orders. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged.
Kiss it bye-bye.
At once. Agreed.
Structure
At
sold.
once. Yes, sir. Reporting. At once. Yes, sir. Very well.
Give it to me.
Affirmative. Affirmative. Yes, sir. Acknowledged. Waiting order. Acknowledged. Yes, sir. Acknowledged. Yes, sir. Very well. Agreed. Yes, sir. Very well. Acknowledged. Awaiting order. Agreed. Reporting. Affirmative. Reporting. Affirmative. Yes, sir. At once. Reporting. Affirmative. Ready and affirmative. Acknowledged. Agreed. Reporting. Yes, sir. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Yes, sir. Acknowledged. Vehicle reporting. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Ready and waiting. Very well. Reporting. Affirmative. Acknowledged.
New construction options.
Reporting. Affirmative.
Building. On hold. Cancel.
Vehicle reporting. Affirmative. Vehicle reporting. Acknowledged. Reporting. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. At once. At once. Reporting. Very well. At once. Of course. Affirmative. Yes, sir. Of course.
Unit
At once.
ready.
At once.
Building.
Yes, sir. Affirmative. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Yes, sir.
Preparing.
Waiting
Unit
order.
ready.
Affirmative.
Building.
Yes, sir. Acknowledged. Yes, sir. Acknowledged. Yes, sir. Acknowledged. Yes, sir. Affirmative.
Our base is under attack. Unit ready.
Yes, sir.
Building.
Acknowledged. Vehicle report. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged.
Unit ready. Building.
Affirmative. 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 Acknowledge. 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 Affirmative. Acknowledge. 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 Affirmative. 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 Acknowledge. Affirmative.
Unit ready.
Affirmative. 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 Acknowledge. sir. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged.
Building. On hold. Cancel.
Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged.
Iron curtain ready.
Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged.
Unit ready.
Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged. Acknowledge. Affirmative.
Building.
Acknowledged. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged. 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 Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged. 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 Affirmative. Affirmative.
Unit ready.
Awaiting. Acknowledged. Acknowledged.
Building.
Yes, sir. Affirmative. Yes, sir. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. 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 Affirmative. Acknowledged.
Unit ready.
Acknowledged. 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 Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. 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 Affirmative.
Unit lost.
Affirmative. Acknowledged. Yes, acknowledged.
Unit
At
lost.
once. At once.
Unit lost.
Affirmative. Affirmative.
Unit lost.
Acknowledged.
Unit lost.
Affirmative.
Building.
Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged.
Unit
Acknowledged.
lost.
At once.
Unit lost.
Reporting. Affirmative. Vehicle reporting. Acknowledged. Reporting. Affirmative.
Unit ready. Building.
Yes, sir. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Yes, sir. Acknowledged.
Unit
Waiting
ready.
order. Acknowledged. Yes, sir. Acknowledged. Yes, sir. Acknowledged.
Building. Allied forces approaching.
Yes, sir. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. 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 Yes, sir. Acknowledged.
Unit ready. Building.
Yes, sir. Reporting. Reporting. Awaiting orders. Affirmative. Reporting. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Waiting order. Affirmative. Reporting.
New
Acknowledge.
construction
Waiting
options.
order.
Unit ready.
Affirmative. Acknowledge.
Unit lost. Building.
Reporting. Acknowledge. 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 Awaiting affirmative. Vehicle report. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledge. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged.
Unit ready.
Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged.
Building.
Awaiting orders. Acknowledged. Reporting. Affirmative. Yes, sir. Affirmative. Affirmative. Yes, sir. Reporting. Acknowledged. Yes, sir.
Unit ready. Building.
Yes, acknowledged. Reporting. Affirmative. Affirmative. Vehicle reporting. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Waiting order. Affirmative. Yes, sir. Reporting. Yes, sir.
Unit
Affirmative.
ready.
Waiting order. Acknowledged.
Our base is under attack. Unit ready.
Vehicle reporting. Acknowledged. Affirmative.
Building.
Yes, sir. Acknowledged. Yes, sir. Affirmative.
Naval unit lost.
Acknowledged. Affirmative. Vehicle report. Acknowledged. Comrade. Acknowledged. Affirmative.
Unit ready. Building.
Yes, sir. Acknowledged. Vehicle report. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Reporting. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Reporting. Acknowledged.
Naval unit lost. Unit ready.
Awaiting
Building.
orders. Affirmative. Reporting. Affirmative. 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 Yes, sir. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Waiting order. Acknowledged. Affirmative.
Unit ready. Building.
Yes, sir. Affirmative. 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 Awaiting orders. Acknowledged. Yes, sir. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Reporting.
Unit ready.
Acknowledged. Yes, sir. Acknowledged. Reporting. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Yes, sir. Affirmative.
Building.
Awaiting orders. Affirmative.
Naval unit lost.
Report. Acknowledged. Yes, sir. Acknowledged. Yes, sir. Affirmative.
Building. Unit
Affirmative.
lost.
At once. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Agreed.
Mission accomplished.